the most disabling thing on earth, this is me talking, is going to be attitudes, right? It's going to be the attitudes we have about people we never met, the attitudes we have about ourselves sometimes that stops us starting something. But you apply social economics to that, then you have a disabling situation. I'm going to give Stephen Hawking's example. If he was a brown guy, same with motor neuron disease, but with the same genius, but from a poor family, would we know him? Would we know what he was? If he was a white working class guy, the first guy from his family to ever go to university, would you have seen that kind of spending power and technology put into him in the early 80s? We wouldn't. And we would all be poorer from that.
Hey Atif, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here with us today.
That's okay. A pleasure. It's real. I like seeing what you've been doing so far. Some of the talks.
I'm interested in this idea of, we say disability rights, but it's really, what do you think is actually a disability?
It can be so many things, and I think that narrative itself needs framing and reframing all the time. And maybe it shouldn't be framed in a permanence, So I know that might sound strange to people to hear. Well, what do they mean by that? And say, okay, well, I'll try and illustrate it. Maybe we'll get an answer. It's a barrier, right? What is the barrier that's preventing you from participating? And what does that barrier look like? For a lot of folks, it's it could be a wheelchair. It could be a white stick. It could be being blind. It could be having not being able to walk. And these are the kind of, I suppose, the optics that people think about all the time when they think about disability.
Yeah.
I would challenge that it's a lot more interesting than that. And people are a lot more interesting than that. Yeah.
If I lived on an island and I was deaf and everybody else was deaf on the island, would I have a disability?
And the question then really is, okay, if I said to you, yes, you would, the question then is, in what way? So if you were poor on that island, you may be deaf and everyone's deaf, but you're poor, which means the others are accessing things that you're not, then we have a conversation to have,
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is you're expanding the sort of the definitions which now are about inclusion, exclusion as well, correct? So it's taking what we think about as sort of the human rights and the world of disability, and now adding another layer of socioeconomic,
absolutely,
right? And bringing in sort of racial equality and thinking about a whole new way. It's really radical thinking in a way of what we thought was very progressive thinking a few years ago. Right? So could you explain a little bit about that just so we get the context?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Look, we've inherited ideas, we've inherited powerlessness, where people who are living experiences of marginalization are not getting to participate in the conversations. They're not participating in the policy changes, and they're not participating on what really says, this is what's meaningful. What is happening is people are saying, okay, at least we're not doing that anymore. So here's progress. At least we haven't done that bit anymore. So we're great, And those are all the mistakes that are happening. So to expand on that, if I said, look, our challenge isn't to talk about people with disabilities. It really isn't. Our challenge is to talk about disablement. And what does that look like? And what does that mean? And who does it? And it shouldn't be complicated. I'll illustrate a point. In major parts of the world, in America especially, being gay is a civil rights issue, but being accepted as a gay person is full of challenges. Now, there wasn't a time not long ago where being gay was a disability, seen as an illness, a mental health illness, etc. Now we can say, look, okay, we've moved on. It's great we've moved on. It's great that we don't say being gay is a disability. But you couldn't say it's not mentally disabling when you can't share who you love with your work colleagues. That you're not sure what nouns to use on a Monday morning when people are talking about their work and their weekends and what they did. You can't mention your partner's name. That's an emotionally troubling situation. Being brown isn't a disability, but working in a racist environment where you can't talk about your mental health needs because it's not safe for you, but it is for others because the invitation is there. is disabling. So what is it we mean by a disability? If you think about the physical differences, of course they're profound, and they're the ones we're used to seeing, but it's the ones that we don't see that also play a role. And that's where I guess we're here to talk about is, can we talk about impact? Or are we going to still talk about people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities? It seems an odd way of going about things to me.
You know, when people hear the term human rights, you know, we tend to think of that as a mountain like cast in, you know, rocks, and, you know, it's just there. But as we go forward, do these rights change? How do we think of these rights? You know, it's like they come from, you know, where do they come from, and how do we, and is it, you know, I saw a little thing with you from, I think you were Maurizio, you know, it's like, is the way that they're thinking about rights there different than, you know, is every society exactly the same, how we think about rights?
No, again, it's that inheritance. You know, you take it for granted. I mean, you're seeing it. We just had Martin Luther King's, you know, day, and it's felt here. It's felt in the UK, right? But these are hard fought out battles. They're driven by lived experiences. They're fought. So we have these rights, but then rights will change. If you think about the idea of emancipation or women's right to vote in the UK, you know, and some of those struggles, they were also class struggles. The idea, not everyone in the suffragettes felt that every woman should have the right to vote, but rather a class of women should have the right to vote. And then we discover, okay, all women need to be included on this, but the narrative, who gets to tell the story? In the UK, these rights are being discussed all the time. We have a social model that you guys don't kind of have the same way. Do you know? I can touch on that a bit more.
Yes, I think it's important for people to understand that.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. I mean, so our organization, which is a group called Diversity and Ability, and it's entirely built on focusing on the strengths of lived experiences. Of course, we talk about disabilities. Of course, we're made up of people with disabling experiences, but that's not the story. The story is, what can you do? What is it that your experience brings, the richness of that? Not the tokenization of it, but the richness of it. And what are the barriers that are in the way that perform that? If your viewers at home, Priscilla, if I may use you just for a moment, would I be right in saying you've been wearing glasses for a long time?
Oh, yes. I've been wearing glasses for 20 years, at least.
20 years, okay.
Yeah, me too, except for I can't see the computer screen, so I got to keep them off. You know what I mean?
Well, let's use the three of us then, okay?
Yeah.
So
yes,
the three of us are using glasses, but when we go to work, we don't have to go through a special door. No one's looking at us going, hey, you okay? Do you need to sit down? What can I do for you? It's such a thing that we don't even talk about it. It's such a thing that it's not a thing. It no longer matters. That's what we're going for here. What we're trying to say is, look, 100 years ago, the three of us wearing glasses would only mean two things. One, we're short-sighted, or long-sighted in your case, Jesse, I think, but also
extremely so, yeah.
Yeah, but that we're wealthy, we have money. How else can we have glasses? Yeah. Now, 200 years ago or 300 years ago, you would be weird. You would just be odd. You'd be really wealthy, but for a lot of people, they wouldn't recognize what's on your face. Mm-hmm. Now we've got to a space where we no longer say, "Hey, Priscilla, are you disabled?" No. Jesse, are you disabled? No. I said, "Oh, but I noticed you're wearing glasses." We no longer think about it. But Priscilla, if I asked you to drive my car, and I'm sure you could, but if I took your glasses off, could you do it?
Well, it depends. Which side of the road are we driving on?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure you'd want her driving your car anyways.
You don't want me to.
Yeah, under the best
but I guess that's my point. And for people to think about it, we no longer talk about glasses. We no longer think about it. But actually, the most accessible device and probably the most groundbreaking device in the world that's changed people's lives is glasses. But we no longer have to worry about whether a person can do a job or not. By looking at their face. We no longer even think that's a discussion. We can get to that space. What we have to do is say, what are the social barriers? What are the narratives? What's the unlearning? And I use that a lot. As a team, we talk, what's the unlearning we have to do? The shaking off to say a person can't do a job just because of our social and implicit biases.
These this pandemic, has it led to, a changing, in terms of technology? People are used to working from home. Is this going to dramatically change the way we think about disability?
I think that there is an interesting position that's going to do two things. We're going to see polarization. We're seeing more polarization. I think you guys, more than any other nation in the world, can probably talk about that polarization in the last, 4 years. So that's going to increase. The pandemic, in terms of economic recession, So when we talk about people, I think we're going to see more people driven further into poverty, and we're going to see people surviving that, probably doing better. But in terms of the job market, absolutely. Look, we're seeing more people in the UK working from home than ever before. But what does that mean? It means that we could have employed more, say, wheelchair users, more people working part-time, more people working, needing to support their families, single mums. Doing these agile ways of working was provable. But it was available in 2017. It was available in 2012. Yeah, but we had this come along and say, actually, we can do this. Now, the challenges in Twitter, I think, is a really good example. A global giant has just turned around and said, look, we're going to probably continue working from home after this as an option. What we're sending a message to is to say, it's not about home working, it's about who we can now employ, how we can encourage the diversity of thought, how we can have more folks working here with lived experiences and different experiences and disabling experiences being part of this team. We can make it as normal as glasses.
Companies now, how much do they, when we say diversity and inclusion, if you really want to be a competitive company, if you want to be a competitive institution, don't you need all these different voices as opposed to excluding them because it's easier to exclude them? Doesn't it make it more, stronger to have all these different kinds of experiences in the
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Where would we be without? Look, I mean, right now, absolutely. Look, I'm talking to an Apple computer, right? Steve Jobs he's a guy that was really, down the road from you guys, I think, in my head. Anyway,
yeah.
California. He was more interested in calligraphy than he was computer design. Yeah. That was his thing. He saw it differently. Where would we be without the diversity? Thomas Edison, the guy was deaf, diabetic, and dyslexic, and was quite a loner. But he was able to, in a world full of candles, he was able to see something and build something that no one else felt they needed. Henry Ford, a dyslexic guy, said, if I gave the customer what he wanted, it would have been a faster horse. So it's the idea that these experiences the diversity of thought can totally enrich the world. It always has done.
So I have a question, because you said from the work that you're doing, and it's a framework, it's a kind of a frame of reference, and thinking of what's exciting about what's missing as opposed to what's horrible. I mean, that's what can we learn, like the things that I don't maybe have, how can those build me up, how can they strengthen me? But that's a cultural kind of mindset. So how do we change culture? Because that's to say that it's not bad if you don't have this, or if you can't see, or if you are dyslexic, or how do we change the culture?
We recognize where the barriers are. Yeah, you got to recognize where the barriers are. So I'm going to give you an example. You could have a guy saying, okay, look, I work here and we made sure we've got ramps here. That's a good thing. That's a good conversation to have. No one was ever disabled by a ramp. No one ever said no. So you can do more ramps, but ramps isn't the question. The question is, even if someone said, I'm going to sit in a wheelchair for a day and see what that's like, you've got to really ask yourself, does that answer the question? Because do you know what it's like to say, look, I might have got the first class first in my degree, and still I can't get a job because of people's implicit biases. No ramp's going to fix that. It's the attitude changes. So what we need to see is a cultural change, which is really, I guess, what we're saying. It's what DNA does. We're trying to reframe it. We're not saying there's a destination. What we're saying is there is a responsibility for everybody to be on a journey that says, look, how are my biases? How are my ways of beginning? How are my lack of friends who are facing physical differences or hidden differences? How does that affect my way of looking at the world and the optics I have? And diversity, I always say, look, diversity is about counting people, but inclusion is about insisting people count. And there is a difference. There is a difference.
Does the word disability, is it partly the language too? That it, does that, do we have negative connotation around that word?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that, you know, dis or ability. I mean, I get that. I mean, you know, there's the language of putting it in inverted commas or in brackets, etc. I get that, but I'm not sure that that tackles the issue. The most disabling thing on earth, you know, this is me talking, is going to be attitudes, right? It's going to be the attitudes we have about people we never met, the attitudes we have about ourselves sometimes that stops us starting something. But you apply social economics to that, then you have a disabling situation. I'm going to give Stephen Hawking's example. If he was a brown guy, same with motor neuron disease, but with the same genius, but from a poor family, would we know him? Would we know what he was? If he was a white working class guy, the first guy from his family to ever go to university, would you have seen that kind of spending power and technology put into him in the early 80s? We wouldn't. And we would all be poorer from that. In the UK, I don't think it's about disability or it really is about disablement and what we mean by that. What do we define that to be? I gave a simple example about just being gay and not feeling safe. You can apply that to so many things. And then you're questioning, you may ask those, is masking something emotionally, you know, disabling? If someone's blind and using a white stick all the time, or using a dog and everyone's patting their dog, great. Everyone's being friendly and they're interacting with somebody. But you could interact with this guy and it might make him get run over. You're interacting with his dog while he's trying to cross the road. That's dangerous. But so if the guy said, look, this is really annoying me, do they get to participate on that, or do they have to endure it? Because they're saying, I'm constantly an ambassador for the Blind Association of Dogs.
That we have, you know, look, that question is incredibly important. And it certainly came up in the United States around the summer with Black Lives Matter and the idea that people have to, Black Americans have to kind of speak on behalf of the suffering. I mean, that is a fundamental and an important question that you bring up. I'd love to know what you think about that.
Again, this is a really important narrative because I don't think there is a consensus of, you know, and I would challenge a conversation around that. But Black Lives Matters is a moment that the world is watching, saying, oh, you know, how can they do this differently? Why don't they do it like this? And what could they do to make this more peaceful? When you realize, look, on any terms in which people are communicating resistance to racist oppression, it's never acceptable. It's never going to be. And that these aren't moments. This you know, America, we watched it for, these aren't moments. These are 400 years of struggle. And that 400 years of struggle takes its toll. It takes its toll from all the microaggressions when children are being taught to dress a certain way by their parents because they're afraid for them. They're afraid for them. They're teaching their children, you know, and I don't think there's a shortage. Really, honestly, I don't think there's a shortage of people not understanding what this is about. You know, when people really say, look, you know, all lives matter, this is straight up just people saying, look, we're racist. We're not comfortable. We're uncomfortable, and we're not prepared to stay uncomfortable. When you have folks that are saying, look, yeah, this must be tough. This must be hard. This must be mentally disabling for every parent to worry so deeply about their children's livelihoods and their safety because of inherent racism, inherent struggles. And these are systemic discussions. And disability is the same. It's a systemic discussion. I mean, you know, Jesse, Priscilla, disability itself is a social concept, right? We decided, just as we've done with color, we decided this is the color that matters. This is the color that doesn't matter. These are the folks who look like us that work, and these are the folks who don't. You can apply that systemic powerlessness and powerful to so many things, you know? But we have a tendency in the world to say, are we talking about Black lives or are we talking about disabled people? Are we talking about this? Are we talking about, and so it's very difficult to separate poverty, I think, from disablement. And I'm not just saying because statistically speaking, you're more likely to be on a poverty line if you're disabled. But rather I'm saying is we don't get to hear the voice of people when they don't access us. You and the three of us are having a great conversation, but how many people who really would be enriched by this? And you guys have got good scope. You've got, you know, you've got people's attention. But people who would really gain from this, would they easily say, well, I'm guaranteed I've got broadband, I'm guaranteed I've got internet access, I'm guaranteed I'm... So that's not necessarily any one person's fault. Of course it's not. It's not anybody's fault. It's about recognizing that we're not living in the world. We aren't. We are living in worlds. And often those worlds are deemed by economics. We like to think they're deemed by values. I like to think I share values with the guy in LA, and I probably do more than the guy who lives next door to me. But it doesn't mean much if the social economics prevent that person from participating with my values. You know, and disability, I think, as I said, it's a word, we've inherited it, but it doesn't tell us anything. What tells us something is impact. What is the impact of the three of us talking to each other, but one of us couldn't afford glasses? What is the impact of that? And that's the conversation, right? But we don't do that. We say, here's the diagnosis, here's the wheelchair, but the wheelchair user, let's not discuss mental health impact. We're too busy talking about his wheelchair. we're too busy. Do you know, that doesn't make sense. So who gets to talk about mental health? Well, the people who don't seem to have a physical disability. That seems odd. No?
Yeah, you know, mental health is tricky because you don't see it. You don't see it. So, in disability rights, it has there's a UN compact on disability rights. And in order to accomplish the compact, there is compromise because people with intellectual disabilities want their parents in the room and people who are deaf and blind don't. What can the greater world of rights learn from the issues that have already we've been dealing with in disability rights? Because we do have this idea that water is a human right, and food security, and the internet, all these different things, but the future generations are going to have to deal with this intersection of all these rights and what it means. So how do you think about that? What can the greater world, the greater discussion about rights, learn from how we've already been negotiating within disability?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. I mean, look, in some ways, you're touching on the United Nations CRPD Accords, the UN CRPD Accords, the United Nations Rights for People with Disabilities. These are rights that are not necessarily protected, so a country can sign up to it, but it doesn't mean it ratifies it. And then the country that does ratify it, maybe it ratifies it because it really believes in it, or its domestic aid is dependent on getting that aid if it ratifies it. So that doesn't deal with the attitude change, right? It just says, here's a poor country and it's got to sign it. But it's a start. It's a start of saying, look, what are the barriers? I have so much more stock. I don't know if I'm being pessimistic or cynical. I don't mean to be, but I have much more stock in the younger generation here that is looking at this. They're seeing the diversity of thought in a way that we didn't really. Despite the stories, and I think that generation, look, it talks about things in non-binary ways. It uses the word fluid for sexual identity. I'm 47. We did not use the term fluid. It was not part of our vocabulary, but you can't tell me it wasn't happening in your generation or mine, right?
Sure.
It really was. So we're getting to a space where I think the internet has a lot to do with that, where younger folks are demanding the intersectionality of discussions. We're discussing now in 2020, or 2021, sorry, that it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. Fine, but really this terminology, Angela Davis talked about this in the 70s. And here we are, watching it 50 years later, being talked about as if it just came out yesterday. So what does that tell me? It tells me that it takes time, but it also tells me, look, we're losing lives here. We're losing the diversity of thought. Alan Turing, I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Sure.
He's about
the code breaker from World War II.
Absolutely. So Alan Turing was autistic. Fine, that's not the most interesting thing about Alan Turing. Being gay is not the most interesting thing about Alan Turing. What's wonderful and most interesting thing about Alan Turing is Alan Turing. Now, we're about to see him on the new £50 notes here in the UK. But the same government, the same country that really led to essentially his mental health breakdown and what led to his own suicide. The brutality of that is real. The guy hasn't changed. The guy didn't do any different work. The guy's work really broke the Enigma machine. It changed the course of World War II. Now, we could either be excited by that diversity of thought and recognize we have a debt to it, and that we don't say he was good despite being gay, despite autism, but because of all the wonder that comes into that ingredients. You can fast forward that. We can fast forward that to now. We can say, look, here's a young girl who has an eating disorder. She's bullied by teachers. She's bullied by teachers so much, her mother says, that she doesn't go to school, and she doesn't go to school. And yet within, 3 years ago, she's not going to school. 2 years later, she's changing the thinking in the Western Hemisphere. A year later, she's shaming a US president. In that same space, G8 leaders are queuing up to be in a room with her. Now, Greta Thunberg's autism doesn't change. It didn't suddenly flick a switch and said, hey, I'm good at this all of a sudden. It's just the same voice, the same position, the same, and yet we're watching spaces change around us. The challenge with disability, and I think this is really a mark for all of us, the challenge of us is not for us to play catch up, not to wait till it's famous and say, hey, look, how can I be in that room with that person? The real challenge is to be humbled by the disabled person, or the lived experience, as I like to call it, the lived experience of the person in the room next to you or with you, and not what they're doing despite a disability, but what they're prepared to share with you, and what it creates in their thinking around the world.
How did you come to this? I mean, this is a really profound way to kind of think of things. And what brought you personally to all of this?
That's a wonderful question. I really wish there was one answer to that, but I can just, I guess, clumsily say it as quickly as I can. I do, I'm part of a project called Diversity and Ability. We're in the UK. We've done great work. We've supported over 22,000 people in the UK, and we're working to support companies across the country do this kind of thinking. And I'd love to say, so that's what we do, and that's how I learned it. But that's not entirely it. I think everyone in our team has a lived experience that's brought them to the front line of things. For me, it was growing up with a different skin color, I'm a dyslexic learner. I struggled to look at people's faces. It wasn't about reading or writing. For me, it was about self-esteem. I couldn't look at people, or let alone say what I'm saying to this. I was known at school for being very quiet, and then I got involved in projects that mattered to me, that taught me a lot. I was involved, I still am, I'm a director of a company in Palestine, and where we import food products to support farmers there. It's won lots of awards. I found my voice, I suppose in some ways, in the most famous political situation in the world, doing a business that no one said could be done. Largely, I think if we wrote a plan, the plan would have said, you can't set up a fair trade company in Palestine. And yet we were so busy doing it that we didn't have time to stop to see that it can't be done. The same with DNA. The idea that we would be saying, look, I'm not here to win awards for the disability employment gap. I'm not here to employ disabled people. I'm here to employ experiences that make this matter, and that it changes people's lives because people can feel the essence of the other people teaching them. It's participation. I guess in my sense, I think I really had to go to political struggles, and I'd always been there growing up in a poor country. I grew up in the largest council estate in Europe. Being brown and dyslexic, I normalized being excluded. I normalized that we wouldn't fit in. I left school at 16. I had every wish to do more of university. But it's that speed in which you normalize things, the speed in which you'd say, that's for other people, and that we can't, folks like us can't do that.
Now, when you say normalized exclusion, what do you mean exactly? Like you just felt like you could never accomplish something, or you saw barriers in school, or you saw barriers in life? Yeah. What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, look, even today, for example, every school in the UK, and the UK is one of the leaders of education system around the world. Yeah, inclusive, well, I won't say inclusive education, but the attempt at that. But the idea of every school today will do something that is done in 1920s. Amazing, willing teachers are confined by three things: working memory, literacy skills, and fine motor skills, cognitive motor skills. Now, kids are defined on those three things. If you don't fit into those three things, I certainly didn't. I didn't fit into working memory. I mean, I don't mean this in a, I just, you'd have to know me more to see that. And literacy skills, no, I don't. I don't write much at all. I mind map every day. I probably make about 6 mind maps a day. But I don't write much. And so it's about reframing. I had to find a way of saying, look, what I have to do and say matters. But I realized, as I said, I've got to unlearn things. I've got to unlearn the idea that my way of doing things is fraudulent, that it's bogus, that it
So
doesn't
you had to think through just an operating system that worked for you. You had to reframe what was happening. Now, is that one of the key insights that made you an advocate for disability rights? Like that you could see that needed to change for you personally, and then you decided you wanted to do that for others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and also being humbled. I was so touched by it. So I started working on assistive technology and realizing there are things I just can't afford. I can't buy these software, but I need it. So I'd look at open source software to see what was free and what would help me address that balance. I didn't realize I had a talent for that. I didn't know that. I didn't realize I had a talent for showing this to other people, but I did. And other people started joining us. What I also could never get across was how wonderful it was when people are saying, you know, up until this conversation, up until I met you, I was masking this.
Right.
I was hiding this, but I want to show you something. And what I got to see was the very thing that I guess I wanted to show people. How do we make this work? And we don't get to make it work if we hide it. The most disabling thing isn't the wheelchair. It's not the white stick. It's not the dog. It's not, it's self-esteem. That's the thing that's going to stop participation every single time.
So did you did that give you purpose when you saw the look in somebody else's eye when you made a piece of technology work for them? Did that give you purpose to push forward?
Absolutely, yeah, in every way. If I can share for your watchers just a quick example, I remember supporting someone and she had severe depression, but that depression was also connected to agoraphobia, but it was also connected to malnutrition. Now, she didn't know that, but she hadn't gone out of the house in 8 months. And she was dependent on, I couldn't really explain it very well without giving it justice, but her grandmother, she lived with her grandmother passed away. The only food that was coming to her was people dropping off food to her house from her grandmother's church. She wasn't old. I mean, she was in her late 30s, but her house, everything looked like an old, you know, a lady in her 90s. I met her, you know, in 2002. What I couldn't understand was how willing she was to let a man bigger than her. 9/11 had happened. You know, I know this sounds a bit strange, but stay with me on this. She didn't know who I was. She let me teach her in her home. That in itself was an act of sheer bravery. And she'd never seen the internet before. That astounded me, but true, right? And so I asked her what her childhood favorite program was. And we just did that and we watched it together. And then this was in 2002, and I introduced her to Yahoo groups of other agoraphobic people. It was the first time she ever saw the internet telling her about people who feel what she feels. I didn't know, it was only later on I realized how hungry she was all the time. As in, and she'd gone past that, you know, past the hunger she'd normalized being malnourished. And so we started ordering food from a supermarket. Yeah, it's quite early days when they started doing that. But it changed the participation, it changed the self-esteem, it started to change. And then eventually, I think one of our sessions, I think we'd seen each other 6 times, she asked me if I'd take her for a walk to meet someone. It was only then I realized she hadn't, when we went to the place, sorry, I should say this, before that, she would put on medication and she lost her eyesight temporarily on the underground. That's a hell of a thing to happen to someone if you're depressed, to temporarily lose your eyesight, right? So your trust mechanism with doctors, everything falls apart. And so what we were dealing with was self-esteem and isolation. The gift she gave me, and I truly mean that, was to ask me to take her somewhere, to trust me to take her somewhere. And she met somebody who had been chatting to her on Yahoo about how to deal with less black days, what to do when the day feels less black than before, and how to act on that moment. These are human-centered solutions, right, to address human-centered needs. And when people are sharing this with you, it's a gift, right? Because no one has to do that. No one has to trust a person, a stranger. We can hide behind computers, and too many of us already do.
So did that put you on the road? That experience, did that put you on the road you're on now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think back, I mean, I guess, as I said, as a team, Diversity and Ability has supported over 22,000 people. We're working with homeless communities, putting technology into the hands of people to express what they need in terms of mental health recovery. But I will always look back to, and I suspect every story is like that. You look back to that one person, and there's countless in my head, but the gift I still think she gave me was trust.
Do you still talk to her?
No. I think that there's I like to think back to the idea that I guess in my head, the idea that I'm showing my age here, but you might remember Banana Bunch.
Sure.
So those guys, and that was the thing. She just giggled and giggled, having watched it, having not seen it since she was like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
And then I still think about the experience of seeing that joy in somebody, and you realizing they've never seen the internet before.
To me, it sounds, so, again, the bearing witness, the community, the sooner that we kind of, I must think that everyone is suffering something somewhere, right? I mean, talk about, I don't know that, does everyone come with a full set of esteem and you're perfect? No, I don't know, but I do hear these solutions to what you're talking about that are simple but powerful. And it's really about acknowledgement of saying, the ability to, or the willingness to say, this is what's happening. And by then you sort of start to put the light on it and things come to life. Is that part of a kind of a repeatable methodology? There's so much sorrow, and we have a lot of ill ease around the world. Can this be techniques that you're talking about? How are you implementing them?
Yeah.
How is it scaling?
Yes, the answer is yes. It's going to take an attitude shift, right? So I'll illustrate. So DNA's team, I mean, here we are working in the UK. There are 14 million disabled people in the UK. But if I use the narrative of disablement, that number is much higher. I'm talking about 14 million people in the UK with protected characteristics, right? That's a huge number, but that number is too small. Worldwide, the most disabling thing that's recognized is mental health, depression. So then you start looking at that and you apply poverty to that, you realize that number isn't a billion people, it's a lot more than that. So you can only frame that and reframe the conversations we're having if there's intent there. The intent is to recognize, actually, how do we move away from whether people are problematized, whether they're an asset to us or not, and start looking at what are the barriers that prevent participation. But we have to actually put more than an egalitarian question here. And by that, it's not just saying it's the right thing to do. Of course it is. But it's recognizing, actually, there's a monetary value. And I think for governments, that's the challenge. There's a monetary value to recognize it's costing us money by not doing this. So mental health costs billions for the UK, and it costs billions more so for the US. It costs you money it costs you more money in terms of health, hygiene in LA, policing, medicine, your doctors, drug rehabilitation. It costs more money to have people mentally ill than it is to send them to college.
In some sense, isn't the fundamental question, what kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to take care of the least fortunate, or do we want to just focus on, at least in America, where great sums of wealth? Is this the fundamental question? Is what kind of society do we want to have in any given country?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a challenge, because here I'm Priscilla, Jesse, we share the same values, right? Mostly, from what I can see. So we can talk about these in egalitarian terms, but that's not what governments are fueled by. we want that to be the case. But, you know, you can't even use the word socialism easily in America without it stirring emotions.
Unless you want to have a fire department or a police department.
But let me give you an example, and I hope this is something to give hope for people. You imagine here in the UK in 1944 when the Blitz was happening, you know, the whole country is under, a bit like we're in at the moment. We've never been in a global situation where we're all so connected, you know. In my lifetime, this is it, and and in your lifetimes too. This is the one we're in right now, where the whole world is watching a space. We're not all in the same boat, but we are all in the same storm, you know. And some of us are going to be weathering this storm better than others, for sure, depending on the boats we're in. But if you'd have said in 1944 in the Blitz of the UK, Blitz of London, completely destroyed, the East End slums, if you'd have said, hey, look, do you know what? We're going to get through this. And what's going to happen here is Africa and India, where we get a lot of money from, they're going to break away. They're going to continue breaking away from us. And you know what? We're going to ration. We're going to ration people here because we're going to be so economically destroyed. We're going to ration food for another 10 years. But here's the thing. It may even get worse that we're going to need the US government and the Marshall Plan to help rebuild the UK economy. And that sounds bleak, right? It's also, but at the same time, in the same sentence or the same conversation, say, but when we do get through this, we're going to get rid of the slums. We're going to have public housing, and we're going to have running water in every household. And when we get through this, we're going to have an NHS system that's going to cover our medical bills for the poor. When we get through this, we're going to have social housing, and we're going to pay for weekends and holidays. And it's going to be a fundamental right in the UK for people to have this. And when you have access to medicine, and when you are having operations for free as part of the national health system, we'll look back to this moment. I would have sounded like a madman, right? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that time you would have, yeah.
Yeah, but it happened. The intent was there. A government hemorrhaging money, a government economically destroyed, showed intent is there. I don't think that I'm talking madness here. It's about people recognizing what do they want with their intent.
In some sense, don't you think we are all in the same boat, even if we're in different parts of the boat, or do you think we're actually in different boats?
Oh God, listen, I am working at the moment. We're watching Palestinians not accessing, you know, and it's on the news now, right? So under the occupation, they're not accessing sanitation needs or medical care regardless. But right now, the vaccine is not available, you know, and other people are. We are definitely not in the same boat. And you're watching people who can in bigger homes. We're watching families in the UK, for example, home teaching. And what happens when you've only got one computer and three kids? Yeah. What happens when your broadband speed can't make the match? What happens to this is you know, I've talked about a kind of health apartheid in terms of people who can access medical care and a vaccine. But I'm also saying there's an education divide. And there's folks who are living in crowded places who are not likely to be able to shield. And there are poor, and you know, LA, you've got it right now. You've got people who cannot, the state may say, stay at home, wear a mask. But you know, you've got folks on subsistence survival who cannot stay at home. The kids will go hungry.
Yeah,
sure.
1,000%. That is it. And so there are many boats, and then there's some people in the water, drowning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We're all in the same storm, different boats. Some have boats, some don't have boats have holes in them. I mean, this is, you know, these are big, really difficult, challenging questions that, I mean.
In your mind, do you think that we ever actually achieve a state of you know, these issues being resolved, or is it just always going to be an ongoing battle with each new generation to redefine our you know, our goals?
Yeah, so I could answer that question differently each day of my life, depending on the mood and what just happened in the morning. In truth, I think that there isn't a destination, and I hope there never is one. You know, that we are constantly reading. What is really good is you're right. I mean, because it is what I like to say is a million mutinies now. You know, that these mutinies are relentless, but they're always informing our practice. They're always informing us. There's a, right now I feel like I'm doing the most progressive work I've ever done in my life. And I'm meeting people because of the pandemic who are sharing the urgency of that wouldn't in 2019. They're like, wow, this is interesting. You're a good guy. We like the sound of you, but that's in Never Never Land. That's in after the Blitz, after World War II, we can think about you. Whereas now people are like, yeah, how can I help? What can I do? And that's a good thing. That the speed of that's a good thing. And I'm even saying this is about corporate leaders who are seeing so much in disarray in their own workforce. But that disarray was masked better before the pandemic. But it was there too. People were masking better, and people are not masking so well. And understandably, how can they? So I would say that there is a mixture of things where it is a million mutinies, and they should always be fighting to inform our process, to showing us. I hope a generation, my own kids, my kid does talks on climate change, and he's 9. It impresses the hell out of me. People say, he's a chip off the old block. And I said, well, not really, no. You know what? He's talking about climate change and I eat meat. He has problems with that. He's not looking at me as a role model for this. And rightly, and he shouldn't. And so I think a generation comes along and says, you know what you did was great, but we're going to take the bars off it, we're going to smash it to pieces because we've come forward. And I think that's the right thing to say,
Well, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this conversation. It's a really powerful, and just thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the energy and the warmth from which you guys have really, started out here, and also just the curiosity. I know I don't pretend to have answers. All I ask is, can we share an exercise in curiosity and what good could look like?
Thank you so much. We hope to stay in touch.
Yeah.
In touch,
sure.
and
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see each other in person one day.
Yes, yeah, I would, yeah, especially now. I feel like it's such a nicer place to go to. I'd like to go to America with some.
Now just I'll leave it with the person now in charge. Is very vocal about his own disability, if you will. Right? We have a person who the other person was making fun of because of a speech impediment. Now we have somebody who celebrates it and is a role model to others. So this idea that you were saying of we see all the great things that come out of a struggle. That's what we're talking about with disability. It's a struggle for something where you have to maybe work a little harder, and then incredible things can come from that. I think it's a great thing for us all to ponder. So thank you so much for your brilliance and shedding light on some of these really complicated.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Atif. Very much. Good to see you.